3:12 a.m. The house was supposed to be asleep. Every light in the east wing was off, every hallway silent, every machine doing the quiet work of keeping two fragile lives tethered to the night. Outside, rain tapped the windows in slow, patient rhythms like time counting itself down. Then the security monitor flickered. Static bled across the screen for half a second, just long enough to make the camera look away. When the image snapped back into focus, a shadow crossed the doorway to the twins' room. The maid stepped inside. She moved carefully, as if the air itself might shatter if she rushed. Her uniform was the same as always, her posture calm, but something was different. One hand was clenched tight against her chest, holding an object wrapped in cloth. Whatever it was, she kept it hidden, angled away from the camera. The monitor emitted a soft click as it adjusted. Infrared light filled the room. Two small bodies lay motionless beneath thin blankets. Tubes, wires. A steady green line pulsed on the screen beside each bed, fragile and precise. Beep, beep. The maid didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. Her lips moved. Not in prayer counting. She set the hidden object down on the bedside table and reached for the first twin's wrist, pressing gently, timing something only she seemed to understand. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders tightened. Then the sound changed. Beep, beep, beep. One of the heart monitors stretched into a long, piercing note. The alarm screamed. Red lights flashed across the screen. The green line stuttered, dipped, and flattened. From another part of the mansion, a man jolted awake. The billionaire bolted upright in bed, heart racing, the echo of the alarm cutting through his dreams like a blade. He stared at the ceiling for half a second, disoriented. Then the sound registered. He was already moving before his feet touched the floor. Back in the twins' room, the maid didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't press the emergency button. She did something else. With shaking hands, she unwrapped the object she had carried in. The camera couldn't see it clearly, only the shape, the motion, the urgency. She disconnected part of the medical setup, ignoring the shrill warning tones that grew louder with every second. The door burst open. The billionaire froze in the doorway, breath caught in his throat, eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. The alarms, the wires. The maid standing between his children and the machines meant to keep them alive. If I had walked in 30 seconds earlier, his voice would later say, hollow and broken, I would have stopped her. The maid turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. Please, she said, not begging, not panicking. Certain. Don't. The monitor screamed again. And then silence. The green line disappeared completely. The billionaire couldn't breathe. His legs refused to move. In that frozen second, every rule he had ever believed in, every law, every protocol, every warning from every doctor collided at once. What she did next was illegal, and it saved their lives. The billionaire had learned how to survive by keeping distance. After his wife died, the mansion became quieter, but not warmer. Rooms stayed perfectly maintained. Schedules ran on precision, and silence filled the spaces where laughter used to live. He provided everything money could buy. The best doctors, the best machines, the best protection. What he could not provide anymore was closeness. Grief had trained him to retreat, to observe life from behind glass. Even his children were not spared from that distance. The twins were born fragile, smaller than expected, their cries weak and uneven. Within months, specialists noticed what no parent wants to hear. Their condition was rare, so rare that most doctors had only read about it. Progressive, relentless. Each week their muscles weakened, their breathing grew shallower, their bodies slowly forgetting how to do what came naturally to other children. There was no cure. Money opened doors, but not this one. Teams of specialists flew in from different countries. Tests were repeated. Scans were analyzed late into the night. Every possibility was discussed and discarded. The diagnosis never changed. The condition advanced quietly, patiently, ignoring hope, ignoring effort. By the time the twins were moved permanently onto life support machines, the doctors stopped speaking in possibilities and started speaking in hours. The verdict came calmly, professionally, as if it were just another item on a checklist. 12 hours. No experimental treatments approved. No emergency authorization. No last resort options left to try. Any unapproved intervention would violate medical law and hospital protocol. The machines, they explained, were no longer healing anything. They were only delaying the inevitable, prolonging suffering. The billionaire listened without interruption. He nodded when expected. He asked the right questions in the right order. When the doctors finished, he thanked them. Then he sat alone in the twins' room long after everyone else had left, watching the rise and fall of their chests, listening to the machines breathe for them. He did not cry. He did not touch them. He stood still, as if movement itself might break what little time remained. That was when the maid entered his life. She had been hired weeks earlier, one of many staff changes made quietly, efficiently. No impressive resume, no references that stood out. Just a woman who spoke little, worked carefully, and never lingered where she wasn't needed. She cleaned. She watched. She listened. She noticed things others missed. The timing of the twins' breaths, the way their fingers twitched before alarms sounded, the subtle changes the machines didn't register. She never offered opinions, never crossed boundaries, never asked questions. Her background was unknown. Not suspicious, just empty. To the billionaire, she was almost invisible. Another employee following orders in a house built on routine and control. She wasn't supposed to care, but she did. In the quiet hours, when the doctors were gone and the night stretched thin, she stood by the twins' beds longer than required. She counted softly under her breath. She adjusted blankets that didn't need adjusting. She looked at the machines, not with trust, but with doubt. And when the clock began counting down the final 12 hours, something in her changed. While everyone else prepared for loss, she prepared for action. Because sometimes, the people with the least authority are the only ones willing to risk everything. And she was willing. The decision to install cameras was made quietly. No announcement, no meeting, no explanations. The billionaire didn't frame it as distrust, at least not to himself. He told the head of security it was precaution, documentation, accountability. When lives were at stake, every second mattered, and every action needed to be recorded. That was the justification. Clean, logical, emotionless. But beneath it sat a growing unease he couldn't name. The cameras were small, nearly invisible, tucked into corners where they could see everything without being noticed. One faced the twins' beds. Another covered the doorway. A third watched the medical equipment. Infrared activated automatically at night. Audio was muted by default, but visuals were enough. The first night, nothing seemed wrong. Staff moved in and out on schedule. Machines hummed. The twins lay still, wrapped in whitened wires. The maid cleaned, adjusted pillows, dimmed lights. Ordinary. Forgettable. Then the billionaire began reviewing the footage more closely. He noticed the pauses. The maid didn't rush like the others. She stopped at the bedside longer than necessary. She leaned in not to adjust equipment, but to watch the twins' faces. Sometimes she lifted a small clock from her pocket and glanced between it and their chests, counting. At first, he assumed she was timing the machines, but she wasn't looking at the monitors. She was counting breaths. Her lips moved silently as she tracked the rise and fall of their chests, fingers hovering just above their skin, never quite touching until she was sure. Then she would place 2 fingers lightly against the wrist, sometimes against the neck. Always brief, always precise. Protocol didn't require that. On the second night, he noticed something else. She carried a small notebook. It wasn't the medical chart. It wasn't logged. It didn't belong to the staff. She pulled it out only when she thought she was alone, jotting down numbers, times, short symbols the cameras couldn't decipher. When another nurse entered the room, the notebook vanished instantly, tucked into her apron as if it had never existed. The billionaire paused the footage, rewound, watched again. Her movements weren't frantic. They weren't careless. They were deliberate, focused, as if she were following a plan only she understood. He felt the first flicker of something dangerously close to suspicion. By the third night, others noticed too. A senior nurse complained quietly to the shift supervisor. The maid was hovering. Another staff member mentioned she had adjusted a blanket without asking. Someone else muttered that she was getting too involved. "She's not following protocol," one nurse said, arms crossed, voice low but sharp. "She's acting like she knows better than the equipment." The word spread. Doctors were informed, not alarmed, but annoyed. "She's a maid," one said flatly. "Not trained, not certified. She should not be monitoring vitals." Another added, "Tell her to keep to her role. Observation is one thing. Interference is another." The warning was clear. Do not interfere. The billionaire passed the message along himself. He didn't confront her directly. He instructed the head nurse to remind all staff, non-medical personnel included, that nothing was to be done outside approved procedures. That night, the maid nodded silently when the rules were repeated. She lowered her eyes, apologized once, promised compliance. On camera, she appeared to follow orders. But the counting didn't stop. It became more subtle, more careful. Instead of standing at the bedside, she pretended to clean nearby, glancing at reflections in glass, timing breaths by sound instead of sight. She touched wrists only when alarms masked the motion. The notebook appeared less often, but when it did, her pen moved faster. The billionaire began watching the feeds live. He told himself it was concern for his children, that he needed to know everything happening around them. But his eyes always drifted back to her. Why was she watching the twins instead of the machines? Why did she write things no one had asked her to record? Why did she tense slightly whenever doctors adjusted settings, as if expecting consequences before they happened? One night, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. 10 minutes before an alarm sounded, she had already stiffened. She looked at the clock, counted, pressed her fingers to one twin's neck, and stepped back just as the machine began to scream. Coincidence, he told himself. It had to be. The doctors dismissed it just as quickly. Machines detect changes instantly. Humans don't. Any perceived anticipation was imagination, stress, grief, projection. Still, they warned again. If she touches the equipment, remove her from the floor. If she disrupts treatment, security will escort her out. The billionaire agreed. He meant to act if it came to that. Then the night deepened. The mansion settled into its artificial quiet. Staff thinned to a skeleton crew. The billionaire sat in his office, security feeds glowing across the wall, a glass of untouched water beside him. The maid entered the twins' room just before 2:55 a.m. She didn't clean. She didn't adjust bedding. She stood still, eyes locked on the twins, hands clasped tightly together. She checked the clock, once, twice. Her breathing slowed. The monitors beeped steadily. Then, at exactly the same moment, both green lines began to waver. 2:58 a.m. The twins' vitals dropped together. Not one both. The alarms hadn't sounded yet. But the maid was already moving. And for the first time, the billionaire felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't coincidence anymore. The clock became impossible to ignore. It hung on the wall across from the twins' beds, simple and white, its second hand moving with an almost cruel precision. Each tick landed heavier than the last, as if the room itself were counting down towards something it already knew. The cameras caught everything. 2:59 a.m. The machines continued their work, but the rhythm had changed. What had once been steady now stuttered short beeps followed by longer pauses, like breaths taken by someone too tired to breathe. The monitors adjusted automatically, recalibrating, compensating, trying to hold fragile systems together with numbers and algorithms. The twins' chests barely moved. The maid stood between the beds, hands folded in front of her, eyes shifting not between the monitors, but between the children themselves. She leaned close, listening, timing the shallow rise and fall with the faintest nod of her head. Count, pause, count again. In another wing of the mansion, the billionaire finally slept. Exhaustion had won. For days he had lived on caffeine and adrenaline, refusing rest, refusing to close his eyes while time slipped away from him. But grief has its own gravity. It drags the body down whether the mind agrees or not. He slept in his clothes, one shoe still on, security screens dimmed but not off. Back in the twins' room, the irregular beeping grew louder. 3:03 a.m. One monitor spiked sharply, then dipped. The alarm chirped a warning, not yet an emergency. The maid's head snapped toward the sound instantly. She was already at the bedside, fingers pressed lightly against the wrist, then sliding to the neck. Her face tightened. The second twin coughed weakly. Not a cry, just a sound, thin and raw. The maid swallowed hard. She glanced at the door. Empty. She moved to the second bed, repeating the same motions, the same silent counting. Her hands trembled now, barely perceptible but there. She steadied them against the mattress. The clock ticked louder. 3:05 a.m. The beeping turned erratic. Short, long, too fast, then too slow. The machines compensated again, increasing assistance, flooding tiny bodies with mechanical breath. Tubes shifted. The green lines fought to hold shape. The maid backed away half a step. She shook her head once. "No," she whispered, so softly the cameras barely caught the movement of her lips. She checked the notebook hidden in her apron, not opening it fully, just enough to see the numbers written there. Her thumb traced a line, stopped. Her shoulder sagged. 3:07 a.m. One of the twins stopped responding. The monitor didn't flatline, but the line dulled, lost its urgency, as if the signal itself were fading. The alarm chirped again, sharper this time. The maid reached for the emergency button. Her hand hovered. She froze. If she pressed it, doctors would come. Nurses would rush in. Protocol would take over. Machines would be adjusted. Orders followed. And nothing would change. She pulled her hand back. In the quiet of the mansion, the billionaire shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The monitors in his office glowed steadily, waiting. 3:08 a.m. The second twin's breathing faltered. Both machines began to beep out of sync now, overlapping warnings that filled the room with chaos. Red indicators flashed briefly, then disappeared, then returned. The maid's breathing quickened. She stepped away from the beds and pressed her back against the wall, eyes closing for half a second. Her lips moved again, but this time it wasn't counting. It was a prayer, not long, not eloquent, just one sentence. Her eyes opened. She looked at the clock. 3:10 a.m. 2 minutes left. She walked to the bedside table and reached beneath it, pulling out the object she had hidden hours earlier. Wrapped carefully, concealed deliberately. Something she had carried through the mansion, knowing full well what it meant. Her hand shook openly now. She hesitated. Everything she had been warned about echoed in her mind. The rules, the laws, the consequences. The certainty that if she acted, there would be no undoing it. If she was wrong, she wouldn't just lose her job. She would lose everything. The alarms escalated. One monitor screamed briefly, then cut back to erratic beeping. The maid looked at the twins, really looked at them. Their faces pale, their mouths slightly open, searching for air their bodies could no longer manage. She exhaled slowly. "If I don't," she whispered to no one, "they won't make it to morning." Her hand steadied. At 3:12 a.m., she made her choice. And the countdown ended. The first thing she disconnected was the alarm. Not the machine itself, just the sound. The shrill beeping cut off abruptly, plunging the room into a silence so sudden it felt wrong. The green lines still danced erratically on the screens, but without the noise, the danger felt closer, more intimate. Like standing in a room with a storm just outside the walls. The maid knew exactly where to reach. Her fingers moved beneath the monitor casing, pressing a sequence she had memorized long before tonight. It wasn't something taught in any handbook. It wasn't something anyone had authorized. It was something learned through watching, listening, and understanding what the machines did and what they didn't. She glanced once at the door. Still empty. Then she turned to the breathing apparatus attached to the first twin. Her hands paused for half a second. This was the point of no return. From here on, every action would be recorded, replayed, judged. Every second would exist forever on a security feed. She swallowed hard and disconnected a single tube. Immediately, the machine protested. Lights flashed. A warning message pulsed on the screen. She ignored it. From beneath her apron, she pulled out the object she had carried all night. Unregistered, unapproved, illegal. It wasn't large. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small vial wrapped in cloth, its label handwritten, faded at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. No hospital barcode. No official seal. Nothing that belonged in this room. Her hands trembled as she uncapped it. She drew a measured amount into a syringe, counting under her breath. Not seconds this time, but units. Her eyes flicked back and forth between the twins, the clock, and the monitors. The second hand swept past 12. She moved fast now. She adjusted the first twin's head gently, murmuring something soothing, though she knew he couldn't hear her. Her fingers found the right place by touch alone. She pressed the needle in and administered the medication slowly, deliberately, as if speed might undo everything. Almost immediately, the child's body reacted. His chest jerked sharply. His back arched. A thin, panicked sound escaped his throat, muffled by the tubing still in place. The monitor spiked violently, numbers flashing too fast to read. The maid flinched, but she didn't stop. She moved to the second twin. This time, the reaction was worse. The child convulsed briefly, limbs tensing, fingers curling inward. The machine screamed silently, lights flashing red in rapid succession. Without the alarm, the only sounds were the ragged breaths and the maid's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Please," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "Please work." She administered the second dose, hands slick with sweat, eyes burning. One tear dropped onto the blanket. Then, another. The twins' reactions overlapped, both bodies struggling, both monitors flashing wildly, the room filled with chaotic motion and breathless tension. On the security feed, it looked like panic, like recklessness, like a woman completely out of control. But she wasn't. Every movement followed a sequence. Every pause had a reason. She watched the monitors not for reassurance, but for timing, waiting for the moment she knew would come next. She reconnected the tube she had removed, adjusted a setting she was never meant to touch, and pressed her palm flat against the first twin's chest, grounding him. "Stay," she whispered. "Just stay." The numbers on the screen dipped sharply. For a horrifying second, the green line wavered, thinned, and nearly vanished. The maid let out a sound halfway between a sob and a prayer. Then slowly the line stabilized, not strong, not steady, but present. She collapsed to her knees beside the bed, one hand gripping the frame, the other clutching the empty syringe. Her shoulders shook violently, but she forced herself upright again. The second twin's monitor lagged behind, too far behind. She leaned over him, brushing his hair back, eyes wide with fear. She adjusted the machine again, this time hesitating before touching the controls. "This is it," she whispered. "This has to be it." She made the change. The monitor reacted instantly, numbers surging, then plunging, then settling into a fragile rhythm that made her breath catch. Both twins were breathing, not because of the machines, because of themselves. The maid pressed her forehead to the side of the bed, tears dripping freely now, chest heaving. She laughed once, a broken, disbelieving sound, then clamped her hand over her mouth to stop it. On the CCTV feed, her face was streaked with tears, eyes wild, hands shaking as she wiped them on her apron and checked the monitors again. She didn't celebrate. She didn't relax. She stayed. Because if she stopped watching, even for a second, it could all collapse. Across the mansion, the billionaire woke with a gasp. His heart hammered against his ribs as if it had been struck from the inside. The dream he'd been having shattered instantly, replaced by a deep, inexplicable dread. He sat up, breath shallow, hands clenched in the sheets. Something was wrong. He swung his legs off the bed and stood, unsteady, already moving toward the security room without knowing why. The screens glowed brighter as he approached, feeds snapping into full focus. And there on the largest monitor, he saw her, kneeling between his children's beds, crying, and doing something no one had ever authorized her to do. He froze, and the truth began to unfold. The security screens snapped into clarity as the billionaire stepped closer. 4 feeds, 4 angles, all showing the same room, his twins' room. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The image didn't match any version of reality he was prepared for. The maid was on her knees between the beds, her shoulders shaking, her hands moving quickly between machines and small bodies that should never have been touched by anyone without permission. The alarms were silent. That alone sent ice through his veins. He leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The monitors on camera showed numbers fluctuating, wildly spiking, dropping, recovering, then dipping again. It looked unstable, dangerous, wrong. "What are you doing?" he whispered, though no one could hear him. Then he saw it. The syringe. Empty now, clutched loosely in her hand as she wiped tears from her face and checked the monitors again. The camera angle was imperfect, but he didn't need clarity to understand the implication. Unauthorized medication, manual intervention, a direct violation of everything the doctors had warned him about. Rage surged up, instinctively hot, protective, panicked. He slammed his palm against the desk. No. He turned and ran. Down the hallway, his footsteps echoed against marble and glass. His breath tore from his chest in sharp bursts as images looped in his head. Courtrooms, headlines, his children dying because he had trusted the wrong person. Security. He shouted into his phone, fingers shaking as he dialed again. "Get the doctors, now. She's interfering." The door to the twins' room was already in sight. He didn't slow down. He threw it open so hard it struck the wall. "Stop." The word ripped out of him, loud and raw, cracking in the air like a gunshot. The maid flinched violently, spinning halfway around, eyes wide. For a split second, terror flashed across her face. Not fear of him, but fear of interruption. Fear of being made to stop. He crossed the room in 3 strides. "Step away from them," he shouted. "Get away from my children." She didn't move. The monitors beeped softly, now not alarms, but warnings. Fragile. Conditional. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded, voice shaking. "You had no right. No right to touch them." "I know," she said. Her voice was hoarse, exhausted, but steady. That steadiness stopped him mid-step. She turned fully toward him, placing herself instinctively between him and the beds. Her hands were still trembling, but she lifted them anyway, palms open, as if to show she wasn't holding anything anymore. "Sir," she said quietly, Please don't touch the machines." The audacity of it nearly broke him. "Get out of the way," he snapped. "Security is coming. The doctors are on their way. This ends now." He reached for his phone again, stabbing at the screen. His fingers slipped, slick with sweat. Code red. He barked into the line. "Unauthorized medical interference. Room." The maid shook her head. "If they change the settings now," she said, "they won't survive it." "What?" He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "You don't know that." "I do." "How?" he demanded. "You're not a doctor. You're not trained. You're a maid." Her jaw tightened, not in anger, but resolve. Behind her, one of the twins let out a weak, uneven breath. The sound sliced through the argument like a blade. The billionaire faltered. Doctors' voices crackled through his phone now, overlapping questions, instructions, panic rising on the other end. "Sir, we need you to clear the room. Don't let her touch anything," a voice said urgently. "If she administered an unapproved substance." "She did," he said, staring at the maid. "She did." He looked back at his children. They were breathing. Not well. Not safely. But they were breathing. "How long?" he asked, voice lower now. "How long until they crash again?" The maid hesitated. "Minutes," she said honestly. "If I stop." His heart skipped. "What do you mean, if you stop?" he demanded. She met his eyes then, fully. No fear left in her expression. Only certainty and something heavier acceptance. "If I stop now," she said quietly, "they die." The words landed between them like a physical force. The billionaire froze. The room seemed to tilt, sound draining away until all he could hear was the faint, uneven breathing of his children and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Die. Not might. Not could. Die. His instinct screamed at him to act, to push her aside, to let the professionals take over, to cling to the rules that had guided every decision of his life. But his eyes betrayed him. The monitors were stabilizing. Barely, but undeniably. Numbers he had memorized over weeks of watching were changing in ways he had never seen before. Tiny improvements. Fragile gains. Real ones. The doctor's voices rose in urgency over the phone. "Sir, remove her from the room immediately." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The maid didn't look at the phone. She didn't look at him anymore. Her focus returned fully to the twins, hands hovering, ready to act again if needed. "Whatever happens to me," she said softly, not turning around. "Doesn't matter." Another breath. Stronger this time. The billionaire lowered his phone slowly. For the first time since the diagnosis, since the verdict, since the countdown began, he didn't know what the right decision was. And the scariest part was this: doing nothing might be the only way to save them. The first uniformed officer arrived before the doctors. His radio crackled softly as he stepped into the hallway, eyes already alert, posture rigid. Behind him came security, then another officer, then the distant echo of hurried footsteps as medical staff rushed from the emergency wing. The billionaire didn't turn when they entered. He stood frozen near the foot of the twins' beds, phone hanging loosely in his hand, eyes fixed on the monitors as if looking away might undo whatever fragile balance had formed. "She interfered with life support," he heard himself say, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "Unauthorized treatment." The officers exchanged a glance. The maid noticed immediately. She straightened slowly, hands lifting away from the machines, palms open. Her face was pale now, streaked with dried tears, but her eyes never left the twins. "I know," she said quietly. "I'll go." One of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, please move away from the beds." She obeyed without resistance. As she stepped back, a nurse rushed in, hands already reaching for the controls, fingers flying over the screen. "No," the maid said sharply, too sharply. The nurse hesitated, startled. "Do not listen to her," a doctor snapped as he entered the room. "Reset the system. Restore original settings." The billionaire's chest tightened. "Wait," he said. Too late. The nurse flipped the switch. The machine surged back to full control, reclaiming the work they had been forced to share. The soft mechanical hiss grew louder. Tubes adjusted, numbers recalibrated. The maid's breath caught. She took one involuntary step forward and stopped as the officer placed a firm hand on her arm. "I'm sorry," the officer said, not unkindly. "You need to step away." She didn't fight him. As the nurse continued, the doctor turned to the billionaire, voice clipped and authoritative. "Sir, whatever she administered, if it caused a temporary response, it's over now. We need to stabilize them properly." "Properly," the maid whispered. The officer tightened his grip slightly as he guided her backward. Then something happened. The room fell quiet. Not the heavy, tense silence of waiting, but a sudden, unnatural stillness. The machine stopped adjusting. The beeping didn't escalate. It didn't warn. It simply stopped. The nurse froze, staring at the screen. "That's not," she muttered. The green line flattened. One of the doctors swore under his breath. "Get ready to." Then the line twitched. Once. Twice. The room held its breath. The twin closest to the window inhaled. Not mechanically, not forced. A real breath. His chest rose unevenly, then fell. The nurse's eyes widened. "Did you see that?" Another breath followed, shallow but his. The machine didn't initiate it. The billionaire's heart slammed against his ribs. What just happened?" he whispered. Before anyone could answer, the second monitor shifted. The second twin's chest moved. A faint gasp escaped his lips, followed by a weak, trembling inhale. The doctor staggered back half a step. "That's impossible," someone said. The machines hesitated, confused, then recalibrated again, this time responding instead of controlling. The numbers adjusted downward, then steadied. Both twins were breathing. On their own. No alarms. No forced rhythm. Just fragile, uneven life asserting itself where it hadn't existed minutes before. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Doctors crowded the monitors, voices overlapping in disbelief. "Check the oxygen levels. That shouldn't be happening. Run the diagnostics again. Is this a delayed response?" The maid stood restrained near the door, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched. She said nothing. She didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled, shoulders sagging as if the weight she had been carrying finally loosened its grip. The officer noticed. "Sir," he said to the billionaire quietly, "what do you want us to do with her?" The billionaire didn't answer. He was staring at his children, at the impossible rise and fall of their chests, at the machines now following instead of leading. A doctor turned sharply toward him. Disbelief etched across his face. "We need to know exactly what she administered. Immediately." The billionaire's gaze shifted slowly to the maid. She opened her eyes and met his look. "I told you," she said softly. "If I stopped, they'd die." The doctor shook his head. "That doesn't explain. This goes against everything we know." "No," the maid replied. "It goes against what's allowed." The words hung in the air. Security radios crackled. Someone outside called for confirmation. Paperwork, reports, consequences lining up like dominoes waiting to fall. But none of it mattered. Not yet. Because in that room, where death had been scheduled and accepted, two small lives were breathing without permission. The billionaire's voice came out rough. "Uncuff her," he said. The officer hesitated. "Sir," I said, "uncuff her." Slowly, the officer released her arm. The maid didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, eyes never leaving the twins. The doctors continued their tests, quieter now, reverent. One of them rubbed his face with both hands, disbelief giving way to something like awe. "We've never seen this," he admitted. The billionaire swallowed hard. Neither had he. And for the first time since the verdict, since the countdown, since the word inevitable had entered his life, hope stood in the room. uninvited, illegal, and breathing. The room didn't calm down for a long time. Doctors moved in careful patterns now, no longer rushing, no longer arguing, checking, rechecking, whispering numbers to each other as if afraid the moment might shatter if spoken too loudly. Machines adjusted themselves again and again, learning how to follow instead of command. The twins slept, exhausted but alive, their breathing uneven, yet unmistakably their own. Only when the immediate danger passed did the questions return. The billionaire stood apart from the group, watching as the maid sat quietly in a chair near the wall, hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller now, emptied of adrenaline, as if the night had taken something from her and refused to give it back. A doctor approached him cautiously. "Sir, we need to understand what happened, what she used, where it came from." The billionaire nodded once. He turned toward the maid. "Tell me," he said, not angrily, not gently, just honestly. "Why?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Her gaze remained fixed on the twins, their chests rising and falling in the soft half-light. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady, like someone who had rehearsed these words many times and never expected to say them out loud. "I had children," she said. The room stilled. "Twins," she continued. "Just like them." The billionaire felt something tighten in his chest. "They were born with the same condition," she said. "Rare, progressive, untreatable. That's what the doctors told me too." Her hands clenched slightly in her lap. "I did everything right," she went on. "I followed every rule, every protocol. I trusted every machine. I waited for permission that never came." Her voice didn't break. "That was somehow worse. They died," she said simply. "One after the other, quietly, on schedule. No one interrupted her." She drew a slow breath. "After that, I couldn't stop asking why," she said. "Why their bodies failed the same way. Why the machines reacted the same way every time. Why the treatments were the same, even when the results never changed." She looked up then, meeting the billionaire's eyes for the first time since the chaos had settled. "I found others like me," she said. "Parents who lost children. Doctors who were told to stop asking questions. Nurses who saw patterns they weren't allowed to document." Her fingers trembled once, then steadied. "Together, they figured something out," she said. "A method, not a cure. A way to interrupt a collapse, if done at the exact right moment." A doctor shook his head slowly. "That protocol was reviewed years ago. It was rejected." "Yes," the maid said calmly. "Not because it didn't work. Because it was too risky." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. "The timing window is narrow," she explained. "If you're early, it does nothing. If you're late, it makes things worse. And if it's done without monitoring, someone could die." The billionaire swallowed. "So it was banned," she said. "Not because it failed. Because no institution would accept the liability." The room absorbed that in silence. "You used it anyway," the billionaire said. She nodded. "I recognized the signs," she said. "The way their vitals dropped together. The timing. The pattern. I knew that moment was coming before the machines did." One of the doctors stared at the floor. Another rubbed his temples, visibly shaken. "You knew you could be arrested," the billionaire said quietly. "Yes. Lose your job. Yes. Go to prison." She nodded again. "I packed the vial weeks ago," she said. "I hoped I'd never need it. I prayed I wouldn't." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. "But when the countdown started," she said, "I knew I wouldn't forgive myself if I watched it happen again." The billionaire's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. "Why didn't you come to me?" She smiled faintly, sadly. "Because you would have had to say no," she said. "And I didn't want that on you." The truth landed slowly, painfully. She hadn't trusted him with the decision, not because she thought him cruel, but because she knew he was human, bound by rules, by fear, by responsibility. She had taken all of that onto herself. "I wasn't trying to save my job," she said softly. I already knew the cost. She looked back at the twins. I just didn't want them to die the way mine did. The billionaire turned away. He pressed a hand to his mouth, breathing carefully, as memories rearranged themselves in his mind. The counting, the notebook, the way she watched the twins instead of the machines. It hadn't been defiance. It had been grief, preparation, love. She never tried to save her job. He realized, the thought forming clearly, painfully. Only my children. When he turned back, his voice was low. Why did you stay after it worked? He asked. You could have run? She shook her head. Because if something went wrong, she said, I wanted to be there. For them, and to face whatever came next. Silence filled the room again. Different now. Heavier. Reverent. Outside, dawn began to creep through the windows, pale and hesitant. The billionaire looked at his children. Then at the woman who had broken the law to give them breath. And in that moment, he understood something that money, power, and control had never taught him. The most dangerous thing in that room hadn't been the illegal treatment. It had been a mother with nothing left to lose and everything to give. Morning arrived quietly, as if afraid to disturb what the night had undone. Soft light crept through the tall windows, settling gently over the twins' room. The machines were still there, still humming, but their role had changed. They no longer commanded breath. They followed it, adjusted to it, responded to it. The twins slept. Not the restless, mechanical stillness of before, but a deep, exhausted sleep that belonged to living bodies. Their chests rose and fell unevenly, imperfectly, and beautifully on their own. The doctors stayed for hours. Tests were run again and again. Blood work, scans, neurological checks that had once delivered only bad news now returned something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The condition hadn't vanished. The danger hadn't evaporated. But the decline, the relentless, scheduled collapse, had stopped, stabilized. One of the doctors finally said the word out loud, almost afraid of it. They're holding. No one celebrated. They simply breathed. Outside the room, lawyers arrived, administrators, officials whose job it was to translate life into legality. Statements were taken, reports written. The word illegal appeared more than once. The maid sat calmly through it all. She answered every question honestly. She didn't defend herself, didn't ask for mercy. When asked if she understood the seriousness of what she had done, she nodded. Yes, she said. I understood before I did it. The officers stood by the door, waiting. Then the billionaire spoke. I authorize responsibility, he said quietly. The room turned toward him. I installed the cameras. I created the environment. I was informed of the warnings, and I hesitated when it mattered. A lawyer leaned toward him urgently, whispering caution. He raised a hand without looking. If there is fault, he continued, it is mine. The words seemed to surprise even him as he spoke them. She acted to save lives when no one else would, he said. If that is a crime, then I will answer for it with her. The room fell silent. The decision didn't come instantly. It never does. But by afternoon, the tone shifted. Authorities spoke in quieter voices. Language softened. Phrases like exceptional circumstances and medical ambiguity entered the conversation. By evening, the maid's restraints were gone. The charges never formally filed were set aside pending review, reduced, deferred, eventually dismissed. When the officer returned her belongings, she accepted them with a nod, not relief. Just closure. She stood by the twins' beds one last time, careful not to touch anything. They're strong, she said softly, as if telling them. Stronger than they look. Then she turned to leave. Wait. The billionaire's voice stopped her. She faced him. I don't know how to repay what you've done, he said. She shook her head. You don't have to. I do, he replied. But not with money. He glanced at the walls. The cameras. That night, technicians arrived not to install anything new, but to remove what had once felt necessary. One by one, the small black lenses were dismantled, wires pulled free, screens darkened. The twins' room was left unobserved, unrecorded, human again. Later, standing before a room of doctors, administrators, and staff, the billionaire spoke openly for the first time since his wife's death. "I believed rules were safety," he said. "That protocol was protection. That control was care." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But rules didn't save my children. A person did." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I failed them by trusting systems more than humanity," he continued. "And I will carry that truth forward." When the room emptied, he returned to the twins. The maid stood at the doorway, ready to go. He stopped beside her. "For the first time," he said quietly, eyes on his children, "I understood the difference between rules and humanity." She nodded once. That was enough. As she walked out into the morning light, the sun rose fully at last, warm and unafraid. Behind her, in a quiet room no longer ruled by countdowns or cameras, two small lives breathed imperfect, fragile, and undeniably alive. And the house, for the first time in a long while, felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The twins slept through the sunrise. Soft morning light filtered through the tall windows, painting gentle shapes across the walls, resting briefly on two small faces that finally looked at peace. Their breathing was uneven, not perfect, not measured by machines, but real. Each rise of their chests felt like a quiet rebellion against the certainty that had once surrounded them. No alarms sounded. No screens flashed warnings. Only the subtle rhythm of life, fragile and stubborn, filled the room. The maid stood in the doorway, unseen. She had changed out of her uniform, folding it neatly over her arm as if this were just another shift ending. Her steps were careful, almost reverent, so as not to disturb the moment. She didn't approach the beds again. She had done what she came to do. Staying longer would have been for her, and this was never about her. She paused once, glancing back at the twins. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, not of pride, not of victory, but of relief. The kind that comes only after fear has finally loosened its grip. Then she turned and walked down the hallway. No escort, no applause, no goodbye. Just the quiet exit of someone who had already paid the price in full. At the far end of the mansion, the billionaire stood alone by a wide window, watching the sky change color. The sun rose slowly, indifferent to wealth, law, or consequence. It had risen the same way on the day his wife died. The same way it had risen on the day the doctors delivered their verdict. The same way it rose now after everything had changed. He held a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. For the first time in weeks, he didn't notice. His mind replayed the night in fragments. The flicker of the security screen, the silence after the alarm stopped, the moment he chose not to intervene. A decision he would have once considered unthinkable. He had lived his life believing that rules existed to protect him from chaos. That protocol was the barrier between order and disaster. That control meant safety. But control had not saved his children. A woman with trembling hands had. He exhaled slowly, watching the light stretch across the garden outside. Somewhere behind him, his children slept alive, not because permission had been granted, but because someone had refused to wait for it. In the quiet that followed, something settled inside him. Not certainty, not comfort, understanding. He knew the world would not celebrate what happened that night. There would be no official acknowledgement, no case study published without hesitation, no laws rewritten overnight. The system would absorb the event, file it away as an anomaly, and move on. But he would not. He would remember the difference between what was allowed and what was right, between safety on paper and courage in practice, between obedience and responsibility. Behind every protocol, he realized, is a choice someone once made. And behind every rule, a line someone drew hoping it would never be tested. That night, it had been. The twins stirred slightly in their sleep, one shifting closer to the other, their hands brushing together instinctively. The billionaire turned away from the window and watched them for a long time, memorizing the sound of their breathing as if afraid it might disappear again. It didn't. Outside, the maid stepped into the morning air. The city was waking up, cars passing, voices rising, the world resuming its pace as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She blended into it easily, just another figure moving forward, carrying memories no one could see. She did not look back. She didn't need to. Somewhere behind her, two children would wake up to a day they were never supposed to see. That was enough. The sun climbed higher, and in a house that had once been ruled by countdowns and cameras, silence returned, not the cold, suffocating silence of waiting for loss, but the gentle quiet of rest. The billionaire closed his eyes. For the first time since grief had taught him to keep his distance, he allowed himself to feel something unfamiliar. Gratitude, not toward systems, not toward rules, but toward a person who had risked everything without expecting anything in return. Sometimes, he realized, the bravest people are not the ones with power, protection, or authority. Sometimes, the bravest people are the ones with the most to lose and nothing to gain. The screen fades to black. A single question remains, lingering in the quiet, waiting not for an answer, but for reflection. If saving a life breaks the law, is it still wrong?